There was a record 303 Major League debuts last year. And today's guest can tell you about every single one. Let's talk about it.
You are Locked On MLB Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, welcome on in to Locked On MLB Prospects, your home for all things minor league baseball. I'm your host, Lindsey Crosby, baseball writer and podcaster. Thank you for making this your first listen every single day. We're proudly part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/locked on to get started today. Very exciting one. We're capping off, or we're finishing up debut week. We've been talking about guys who came up last year, made their first impressions in the bigs. We talked about contract extensions for them, things like that. And I thought, what better way to finish this off than to bring in an expert? So I've got James Bailey, former Baseball America editor and writer, former Durham Bulls employee, but just came out with a new book, Major League Debuts 2023. Covers, obviously, kind of self-explanatory, covers every single player that debuted last year. And James, I noticed when reading through the book, and thank you for the copy you sent over to the studios, last year you had a record of 303 players debut in Major League Baseball last year. Do you have any sort of idea, as somebody who's an expert at this, obviously, do you have any sort of idea as to maybe why you would have so many players debut in 2022?
I think there were a couple of big factors. The lockout and the delayed start on the season was a big factor because you had, for the first month of the season, you might recall there were 2 extra spots on the roster. You had pitchers that weren't fully ramped up thanks to the shortened spring training. So you had teams that were carrying extra pitchers. The COVID still played a role in a couple of different ways. You had players that when they got sick, the teams were allowed to bring in replacements with without having to, go through the steps of putting players on the disabled list, or injured list now, sorry. And then you also had the Toronto situation, and you had several players who their only appearance was when they went for a trip to Toronto because they had other players on the team who weren't vaccinated and weren't allowed to cross the border. So they were placed on a restricted list, and the teams were allowed to bring up replacements. And so there were several players who, like I said, I think their only appearance of the season came in Toronto. And then you had a bunch of other players who made their debut for their games in Toronto, which they likely would have debuted later in the season anyway. So I don't think that padded the number quite as much, but I think those were your biggest factors and why there were so many. And I would expect that number to drop a little bit this year.
Yeah, and it seems like the Toronto situation made it where, if nothing else, you got the ability to get Major League StatCast data on some of these minor leaguers. I'm thinking about Kansas City, where it felt like they brought almost the entire minor league team up when Kansas City went to Toronto because so many guys weren't vaccinated. And so as prospect people, it's kind of nice to get some of that advanced information about how these guys do against Major League pitching, about how they do in Major League parks, because you had to make kind of a wholesale line change, hockey style, in there. I did notice that the average age, and it's kind of interesting how this worked out. The most common age for a debut was 24. The average age was 25. And that feels a little bit older than I expected to hear. Do you think that that's something where losing a year in 2020 kind of pushed back a lot of developmental schedules, or is it just maybe you had some outliers like a Mark Apple who got called up at age 30 that kind of skewed it a little bit?
I think as far as the average going up to 25, I would have to go back and look at what the actual averages were on some of the others. I do think you had a number of players who their debuts were sort of pushed back. We might be seeing the end of that now because it's
Mhm.
been a couple of seasons, but there were also a number of older players that came up. There were players 30, 31, 32 years old. I think we had 3 32-year-olds break in. So they're kind of pulling the average up a little bit there.
Yeah, and some of those stories are just the really cool stories. The guys that are almost the career minor leaguers. I remember Winton Bernard of the Rockies was a big story when he finally made it up, and I want to say he was up for a little while and went back down. The one that kind of stood out to me, I noticed, was Fernando Cruz of the Reds. It was something where and I really appreciate the way that you lay this out in the book. So, for those of you who don't have the book yet, obviously, wherever you get your books online, you can go out and find it. But it kind of tells the story about their debut and their first appearance. And so, I'm looking at Fernando Cruz of the Reds, 32 years old, and I can go through here and it talks about, like he got Charlie Blackmon to fly out to left field and then struck out CJ Cron on a changeup at the bottom of the zone. It really feels like there's the entire story of that first appearance and then their background and what they did over the course of the season. What kind of time did it take to get these little capsules for each player for all 303? Like how much time were you looking at spending on this per player?
Um, Altogether, I don't. Each player took several hours to put
Mhm.
together, and that was, going through their debut. And I kind of mentioned to you before we started, I went through pitch by pitch on a lot of it because
Mhm.
the video is available, and you can see exactly what happened. But the background is what takes most of the time. And then you see a guy like Fernando Cruz who has so much to his background and such an interesting story because that guy was drafted in 2007 as a shortstop,
Yeah.
and his first position change wasn't to pitching; it was to catching. And the Royals gave him a short look there, and then tried him out on the mound, and then let him go. And so his career just kind of drifted around, but he just never gave up. He never stopped pitching, and I think he's probably going to make the opening day roster for the Reds this year because when he came up last year, he came up at the beginning of September. He wasn't just a good story. He was actually a good pitcher. He did really well for them over the final month of the season. And I think they have something there. And, even though he's short on major league time, I think, especially with a young team there, he's kind of respected as a veteran presence, and he has a lot to share with young players on that team, even though, like I say, most of his experience came, you know not even in the minor leagues. He was bouncing around everywhere. He played in Mexico, he played in the independent leagues. So
Yeah,
yeah.
he played like winter ball in four separate countries. He different sort of independent ball and things like that, but it's still baseball experience. You still learn how to get guys out. And to your credit, in the book, what I love is that you lay out all of the statistics in their career, not just what they did last year. And so it's just wild to go back and look and see like here's his hitting stats from 2007 when he was with the Royals and then obviously switches over to pitching and then going all the way through a 1.23 ERA in 14 appearances in that ballpark in Cincinnati is definitely nothing to sniff at. And like kind of explains, yeah, no, he's a legitimate MLB piece for the Reds this year, despite not debuting till age 32. So I just think that's kind of cool how it's so thorough. And this is definitely a reference document that you can keep on your desk next to the Baseball America handbook and things like that if you're a prospect person like me or like the listeners of this show who obviously are here about prospects. uh 303 debuts in this book. What's the like I think the best story for you? And Fernando Cruz obviously has a really good story. What were some of the other really interesting debut stories? I picked a few out that I really liked, but I'm kind of curious from the guy who did them all. What's your favorite story?
If I could remember them all. I always throw Ray Kerr out there,
Mhm.
just because here's a guy who he was not, I think he a left-handed pitcher who probably threw pretty hard for a high school kid, but he played for Hug High School in Reno, Nevada, and he wound up pitching 1 year and playing first base at
Mhm.
Mendocino Community College in California, and then he
Mhm.
just gave up and just walked away and went back home and got a job in a movie theater, like any other average guy who can't throw baseballs hard. But he got talked into coming back. Eventually, worked for Lassen Community College. He pitched well enough there that he had interest from the Alaska Baseball League, which is a collegiate summer league. That's one of the longest running collegiate summer leagues. He went up there and did really well against Division I hitters, and he was going to transfer to NAIA school, Cumberland University, and
Mhm.
the Mariners, and I think the Marlins were in on this too. They kind of interrupted him and were like, "Hey, can you throw a bullpen for us?" And Mariners signed him for $5,000 before he ever made it to a 4-year school. And he wound up as part of the Adam Frazier trade. He wound up with the Padres and made his debut last year. So he's kind of a fun story. Um, I like Kevin Herget's story too, because here's another guy who he's got a bit of an unusual background. Another guy who came from, he was in Division III, Keene University. He played in 3 consecutive Division III World Series,
Wow.
and but he's a 5'10" right-hander, so he's not fitting the usual build and profile that people are looking for. And he didn't even figure he was going to be drafted. He went back home after graduation and he applied for a job coaching youth baseball in New Jersey. And to his great surprise, he was drafted by the Cardinals in the 39th round. And this was back in 2013.
When you had 39 rounds, yeah.
Yeah, you can't do that anymore, can you? Um, so he worked his way up through the system mostly as a reliever. He spent I think the 2018 season in AAA as a starting pitcher, and then 2019 he blew his elbow out and had
Mm.
Tommy John. And so while he's recovering, then comes along COVID, and there's no baseball. And in 2020, he spent time in the Cardinals front office as a baseball operations intern. And so he worked for the Cardinals as an intern in their front
Mhm.
office 2 years before he made his major league debut, um, and which he did last year for the Rays. Uh, he also, at the end of the 2020 season, he was released. He went through independent ball, signed with the Indians. Um, was ended up in independent ball again, but these guys just didn't quit, and that's why they're fun. And he also, another interesting thing on him is he did some part-time video scouting last year while he was in the minors with the Durham Bulls. He worked for Sports Info Solutions to make a few extra bucks, but that guy, when he's done, and he's not done yet because he's still in Reds camp, and I think he's got a shot at making the team this year. When he does finish his playing time, he's got a future in baseball in some capacity, and he's got quite an interesting resume already.
Yeah, these guys who go to independent ball and then come back into affiliated organizations, like it's obvious they're doing this because they love baseball and baseball was their life. And so it's kind of hard not to cheer for guys like a Kevin Herget. And he was actually on my list of some of the ones that I found really interesting. I had him bookmarked in the book here to talk about a little bit later. Back to our conversation with James in just a minute. But first, today's episode is brought to you by our friends with Ultimate Pro Baseball GM. I am thrilled that they have partnered with the Locked On Podcast Network because it is my favorite mobile game right now. If you've ever dreamt about being a Major League Baseball GM and managing a professional baseball franchise, who to hire, who to fire, accumulating talent in your farm system, everything, this is the game for you. You manage every single strategic aspect of your team, play through the season, and lead your team to a championship. You're responsible for hiring coaches and staff. As far as what scheme do you want, the personalities you want, all of that, you are in charge of the team finances to make all of that happen. You're in charge of scouting and drafting players. Defensively, do you want to prioritize Range, you want to prioritize an arm in the outfield. You can make that kind of decision. Do you want to prioritize catcher defense, catcher offense? You can make that kind of decision. You also have to manage the personalities of the players you bring in. You may have an option to add a free agent that is very talented, but also is a little more difficult to deal with in the locker room. So, that's part of free agency. You have to evaluate all those different aspects and deal with all of this. And it's a challenging but realistic and very detailed game world. And what I love about Ultimate Baseball GM is all of this is completely free. You can play it offline, so you can do it on the go as you want, when you want. There's no real world time restrictions that go along with Ultimate Pro Baseball GM. So, Locked On MLB Prospects listeners get 100% free boost of their franchise when you use the promo code Locked On in the game store. So make sure to check that out. Again, completely free, no expectation to purchase anything in the game store. Just get you 100% boost to your franchise. To download the game, probaseballgm.com, scan the code on the screen if you're on video, or look it up in your respective app store. That's probaseballgm.com. It's the Ultimate Baseball GM. Start your dynasty today. We are joined by James Bailey, author of Major League Debuts 2023 edition, covering all 303 players that debuted in the major leagues last year. James, what I love about some of these nuggets is it's not just the detailed story about their background and about their first appearance, but interesting notes about what they did last year as a whole. The thing that I found really interesting, so Bennett Sousa, left-hand pitcher for the White Sox, he gets 9 pitches in relief on opening day. I'm trying to remember if that's a game the White Sox go on to win or not. But what I find really interesting is you point out he's also the player who was on the mound for that notorious 1-2 intentional walk of Trey Turner that Tony La Russa called. And it's really interesting to kind of see back and be able to look and say, okay, yeah, like he debuted in June. Here's the path of how his season went. And then also he was on the mound for this really weird thing that happened back, like in June, that it was the talk of baseball. He's the unspoken part of that story. And I just find it great how there's all of this detail about all of these players, and it makes it a fantastic reference.
Well, I think if anybody remembers that story, they'll remember Tony La Russa and Trey Turner, but there's very little. You're not remembering who was on the mound, and especially for a guy who had, let's say, not a lot of capacity to say no. I mean, perhaps if there were a veteran reliever out there, I don't know who would have been likely to be like, Tony, I'm not doing that. But he wasn't going to say no to that, and it, it did kind of catch some headlines for a couple days.
Yeah, and it's just one of those like I had forgotten who that third person was involved in this story until I saw him in the book. An interesting story to me. I think it's really funny, and there's not detailed statistics on this, but I'd be curious to see how often it happened. Eguy Rosario of the San Diego Padres made his debut at the plate against a position player. He got to hit off of Hunter Dozier, and I want to say I think he was coming in for to third base in place of Manny Machado. But I just find it interesting that his first plate appearance was against a position player and not an actual pitcher. Can you think of any really just interesting or noteworthy debuts like that where it's an odd scenario that maybe you weren't expecting when you went into it?
I think it would have been great if he was making that against a position player who was also making his debut, but that would have been pushing it too far. I kept looking for that Moonlight Graham situation, and there were some that were kind of close, where a guy maybe came in as a pinch runner for his debut or whatever. But I'll throw one out at you, and I'm sure he's probably got some bittersweet memories about his debut. Would be Jack Larson, who was a outfielder for the Mariners. There were a couple of players. I think Julio Rodriguez might have been out at the time, and there was another outfielder out for the Mariners. And the Mariners called up Larson and Jared Kelenic. and Larson got there first. Kelenic, I guess, was his arrival was delayed, so Larson got the start, and
Mhm.
he got one at bat, and then they pulled him when Kelenic got there. When he finally arrived in like I can't remember if it was the fourth inning or whatever, but they 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 took Larson out of the game. And this at the point in time, I mean, if you say Kelnick was hitting like he is in spring training this year, maybe it would make sense. But at the time, he was back in the minor leagues because his batting average was in the low 100s, and I'm just thinking, wow, you got pulled for a guy who's not even hitting anywhere near the Mendoza line, and that was it. That was all Larson got to play. So. He did. I'm not sure if he's been sent back down to the minors yet. I know he was playing a bit this spring.
Mhm.
Maybe he'll get another crack at it. Not a highly regarded prospect in that system, but um,
I mean, it kind of sounds like they don't think much of him for the fact that they benched him mid game for a late arriving Jared Kelenic. It does note in the book, I went and found him while you were telling the anecdote. He won the Edgar Martinez Dominate the Zone Hitter Award in the organization, which makes it even funnier that they thought he was good enough offensively to win an award, but they couldn't keep him in for a second at bat in his debut game. I find that really, really funny. Back to our conversation with James in just a minute, but first, today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. We are at the NCAA tournament. It is actively going on right now. It is the perfect time for you to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. New customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, super easy to use. You can bet on everything from the money line, points scored, 3 points drained, player points, rebounds, assists, individual projections like that, as well as core markets like the spread, the money line, what the total might be, and then exclusive bets like the 2x3. Will there be 2 3-pointers made in the first 3 minutes? And then you can combine all of these bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same game parlay. So don't miss your chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets back when you go to fanduel.com/locked on. That's fanduel.com/locked on to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. I did enjoy the story of Cooper Hummel. And this is something we talk about a lot on the show, is about the value of going outside of your comfort zone and doing other things in baseball. And so Cooper Hummel debuted for the Diamondbacks, gets the job out of spring training. But the whole story is like he starts off as a Mariners fan, is in professional baseball, and the Brewers, when he finally joins the Brewers, they move him to the outfield. And so he's like, yeah, sure, I'll play the outfield. Not a big deal. And it's kind of timely because we saw in the World Baseball Classic, MJ Melendez, like he did last year, was playing in the outfield, but he was in right field and having a good day. And it goes on where Hummel's now with the Diamondbacks, and he gets time in the minors in the outfield and ends up being Carson Kelly's backup for the end of the season, and then got traded back to his hometown Mariners when the season was over. And so that story to me was one of those, if you're a young player, a young baseball player who a coach approaches you and says, hey, I have this idea for something you want to try. Cooper Hummel's kind of the story of like, yes, you should do that, because maybe one of the only reasons he was able to stick around in the organization as long as he did was because he was willing to move from behind the plate to the outfield when he was with the Brewers.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that says a few things. It kind of, to me, says, hey, we like your bat. We're not crazy about your catching.
Your
Uh,
defense.
but and I think the Diamondbacks may have shared some of that sentiment, because I want to say, and I'd have to look back at it because I don't remember the exact details, but I believe he was sent back down at one point to brush up on his catching in AAA, because they were getting to the point where they were frustrated with some of their other backup catchers, and they were like, you know what? We're going to give you a look back there. And he did get a lot more playing time down the stretch. But what I loved about his story was, I think he grew up in Portland, or right outside of Portland, as a Mariner fan, and his dad painted a Seattle Mariners mural on his wall as a kid. And when I saw over the winter that he got traded to the Mariners, I was like, oh, that's cool. He loved the Mariners, And so I think I saw a story. I think in the Seattle Times a couple days ago, talking about him and his chances of making the team, and that flexibility, and he's got the he can back up catcher, he can play the outfield. They were looking at playing him a little bit at first base, but he was saying he was having the time of his life in spring training, and you're like, nope, not a surprise because he's on a team he was grew up rooting for. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, it's one of those things, and prospects that have come on this show have kind of had to remind us, like they don't, for the most part, they don't get to choose the organizations they're a part of, and they may have
No.
grown up a fan of somebody else, and so always a cool time to be in the organization that you grew up idolizing and that you dreamed about and things like that. So James, as we're getting into the 2023 season, I'm assuming obviously there's plans for another edition of this book. How much work have you done ahead of time versus how much are you waiting until after the season? Because I know for last year, this book kind of came together once the season was over. And I think there was maybe 3 debuts on the final day of the season, which threw your number off a bit. But how much work are you doing trying to get this ready ahead of time this year?
I've started writing some of the obvious candidates, trying to go through some of the backgrounds. You had, there's certain guys. Andrew Painter, I'm really rooting for that elbow to hold up because I already have his background written up. Plus, he'd be a lot of fun to watch. My son's a big Phillies fan. We took him to his first major league game last year when we went to Philadelphia in the summer, and so there's a Phillies rooting interest in our household now. So we're rooting for Andrew Painter to do well, and the rest of the team. But there's a bunch of guys I've already had a crack at collecting information or writing up the background. So I feel like I will be much farther along this year and not have such a crazy rush at the end. And I'd also, if possible, like to get the book out earlier. It came out right at the end of January this year, and it'd be nice to push that up a little bit. Um, hey, people are always looking for Christmas gifts, right? It'd be nice to be out in time for that.
There you go. And speaking about books, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention you're not only an author for this, you're a novelist. You have a couple fiction books. The Greatest Show on Dirt is a baseball themed one, as well as $9 a pound. So if you're looking for a baseball themed gift for the person, and for a special someone in your life, there are multiple options from James you can go out and get. It's not just a reference guide for prospectors, but it's also novels about your time, or I guess not your time, but based around some of your time in baseball, both with the Durham Bulls, I believe, as well as working for Baseball America.
Yeah, the Greatest Show on Dirt was set in the old Durham Athletic Park, kind of in that times when I worked there, which was in the early '90s. I worked there for 3 seasons, and it wasn't long after that when they moved on to the new stadium, which is a great stadium, just
Yeah.
maybe not quite the same character level, at least for people who are nostalgic like myself. And then $9 a pound was a set more in the early to mid aughts, about a player who wasn't regarded as a high prospect, but he kind of tapped into a little extra power through some maybe questionable means, and then the fallout eventually when it comes out that he had used some performance enhancing drugs, and what that meant for his career. I thought that was a nice story all the way through. I think it was kind of overshadowed, I think, sales wise compared to the Greatest Show on Dirt, but I think I'm pretty happy with the way that one came out. But that's been a while. Those books came out almost 10 years ago now.
Kind of curious to see how I have them both on my to be read list. Just pick those up from an online book purveyor. So I'm very curious to kind of see how those do and to get more into the baseball fiction. James, thanks for the time today. Where can people who are listening go out to follow you and what you're doing and what you're talking about?
The website now, with all the stuff is majorleaguedebuts.com. Should be, if you can remember the name of the book, you got the website down. And then on Twitter, James_L_Bailey. And then the books can be found Amazon or any online bookseller in print or ebook, whatever your favorite ebook format. It's out there.
Perfect. Thanks for the time. And folks, this will do it for this week of Locked On MLB Prospects. Reminder, if you have questions for Monday's mailbag, I'm on Twitter at Crosby Baseball. Show's on Twitter at Locked On Farm. You can email us, lockedonmlbprospects@gmail.com, or leave your questions in the Locked On MLB Prospects Discord. Links in the episode description, links in the show notes. For James Bailey and myself, that'll do it for the Friday edition. And remember, it's always a good day to pay a minor leaguer.